He was sitting in a parking lot he'd never been in before, watching his wife move among strangers with a warmth he hadn't seen directed at him in 9 months. And his hands were folded in his lap and perfectly still the way they went when he was deciding something. If you've ever done everything right and still spent years paying for it, this one's for you. Welcome to Strong Mind Stories, character-driven stories with a twist you won't see coming and an emotional truth you probably will. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more. Let's get into it. The hillside smelled of dust and dry sage and something underneath. Over 9 years, Tom Cole had learned to associate these smells with waiting. He'd been waiting for 3 days. The position was good, a natural depression in the rock shelf, 40 meters below the ridgeline, shaded from the south by an outcropping that would keep him in shadow until well after noon. His spotter, Danny Reeves, was 2 feet to his left, prone, the spotting scope steady against his cheek. They'd been here long enough that the ground had shaped itself to them, or they'd shaped themselves to the ground. By this point, there was no meaningful difference. 430 meters below, a walled residential compound sat at the edge of a small city, its courtyard visible through the gap in the eastern wall where a door had been removed and never replaced. The target had been confirmed on 3 separate days. He was a logistics facilitator for a weapons network operating across 3 provinces, a man whose work had moved materials that killed American soldiers and local civilians, documented across 4 independent intelligence streams, and authorized for engagement at every level of the chain above Tom's head. The intelligence was the most thorough Tom had worked from in 9 years of doing this. The authorization was unambiguous. The situation was as clean as situations got. He'd made harder shots in worse conditions. The wind at his position was light and steady from the northwest, 3 to 4 miles per hour, consistent across the valley floor. He'd been reading it for 72 hours. He knew the air the way you know a room you've lived in for years, where it pooled, where it shifted, what it did in the hour before the temperature changed. The target appeared in the courtyard at 6:43 in the morning, the way he had on each of the previous 3 mornings, moving from the inner door to the east wall where someone left his tea on a small bench. Tom settled his breathing. He found the stillness that was the whole of the job, not the mechanics of it, not the training, but the particular quality of interior silence that the mechanics and the training had been building toward over the course of his military career. The world simplified itself. Wind speed, distance, the angle of the light. The shot took less than a second. Tom moved off the position the way he always moved, efficiently, without ceremony. No thought given to what came after, because what came after was not the job, and the job had been done correctly. Danny was already gathering the spotting equipment. They were down the back of the ridge and into the vehicle in 4 minutes, moving through the dust toward the extraction point. Tom said nothing. Danny said nothing. There was nothing to say. The shot was clean. They both knew it. 3 days later, Tom's unit swept the compound. The structure had the particular quality of a place that had been emptied in a hurry, drawers pulled out and left pulled out, a chair knocked to its side in one of the back rooms, a door left open onto a courtyard where the afternoon light sat flat and still over everything. Tom moved through the rooms with his weapon up, boots crunching over broken plaster, the air thick with dust and something chemical underneath it that he'd long since stopped trying to identify. In the last bedroom, a secondary blast from an earlier strike had taken out most of the eastern wall, debris across the floor, chunks of plaster and roof tile, and the splinters of what had been a bookshelf, a framed photograph, half buried under the fallen shelf, face down in the gray dust. Tom almost stepped over it. He stopped. He reached down and picked it up and turned it over. A man, and a boy of about 7 years old, sitting on the man's shoulders. Both of them laughing at the camera in the way people laugh when they're not thinking about being photographed. Open, unguarded, their faces completely given over to whatever was happening in that moment. Some ordinary thing that had made them both helpless with joy. The kind of picture that gets taken at a birthday, or a picnic, or an afternoon that seems ordinary while it's happening and only later becomes the one you frame. The frame had a cracked corner. The glass was intact. Tom stood in that room for longer than he should have. The man in the photograph had been exactly what the intelligence said. He reviewed the facts the way he'd review ballistic data, checking each one, finding each one sound. The target's role confirmed. The authorization in order. The outcomes the mission had prevented, documented. Everything checked out. He knew everything checked out. He set the photograph back down, face up, on the cleanest section of shelf still standing. Then he walked out of the room, rejoined his unit, and said nothing to anyone. He didn't know it yet, not fully, but he had just picked up something heavier than that frame, something with no weight you could measure and no way to set down, and he was going to carry it all the way across the world, through the gate at McCord, up the stairs at the house on 38th Street in Tacoma, and right to the edge of a chain-link fence in Federal Way before it finished arriving. Tom Cole had been a sniper with the 2nd Ranger Battalion out of Joint Base Lewis McCord for 9 years. He was 34, lean and hard in the way that comes from the work rather than vanity, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples and a quality of stillness that the people around him often mistook for calm. It wasn't calm. It was the specific quality of a man who processes everything inward and releases nothing, which looks like calm from the outside and feels, from the inside, like a room filling slowly with water. He and Elena had met 11 years earlier, married in a small ceremony in Gig Harbor on a Saturday in October, when the water was flat and the leaves were going. Benny had come 18 months after, dark-haired and serious as an infant, loud and relentless as a toddler, and now, at 7 years old, a precise, earnest boy who narrated his own activities under his breath and had inherited from his mother the habit of asking the one question a room wasn't ready for. Tom had landed back at McCord in December. Elena and Benny were at the gate, Benny holding a sign that said Dad in letters that started large and got progressively smaller as he ran out of room. Tom picked the boy up and held him for a long time, face pressed into his hair, and felt something he couldn't name loosen slightly in his chest. He thought for about 4 days that he was going to be fine. The feeling that everything was not fine arrived quietly. He stopped sleeping through the night. Not dramatically, no episodes, just a surface awareness at 2 or 3 in the morning, completely awake, staring at the ceiling with a strange lucidity. The image always waiting for him in that lucidity was the same: a man and a boy, mid-laugh, the cracked frame, the gray dust, the face-down photograph in the rubble that he'd turned over and couldn't turn back. He started going out to the back porch in the evenings. First 20 minutes, a beer, some air. Then an hour. Then 3 beers that didn't do what he needed them to do but at least changed the frequency of his thoughts slightly, the way turning a radio's tuning knob moves you from one static to a different static. He was still functional, showed up, performed, hit every required target. Functional was the word he used for himself, the way a mechanic describes an engine running below spec. Still operational, getting from one end of the day to the other without incident. But he was short with soldiers in ways he'd never been before. He snapped at Benny twice over nothing, shoes in the hall, a permission slip left on the counter, and on the second occasion, Benny looked up at him with an expression that lived right next to fear without quite being fear. And Tom went outside and stood in the cold for 20 minutes, unable to locate the man he'd been before Syria turned him into this compressed, pressurized version of himself. Elena made attempts. She was precise about it, the way she was precise about everything, not dramatic, just finding the quiet moments and placing the conversation directly in front of him. In early February, she said she needed him to talk to someone. He said he was fine. She said she knew what fine looked like on him and this wasn't it. He said he'd think about it. She nodded in the way he knew meant she was giving him time, but he knew that that time came with the expectation that he would get back to normal, like he always did. Over time, something shifted in Elena. Not dramatically. She didn't do dramatic. It was more like a door that had been slightly open beginning to close in increments too small to track individually but unmistakable in aggregate. She started going out on Tuesday afternoons. Gone by 1, back by 5:30, sometimes with grocery bags and sometimes without. When he asked what she'd been doing, she said helping a friend and changed the subject, and the topic closed without fully closing. He found the drawing in her bag in early March, looking for the car registration she'd asked him to find. A folded piece of paper, a child's drawing in crayon, 4 stick figures standing in front of a house, a large yellow sun in the corner, everyone with circular smiles. Benny produced drawings like this regularly, left them in drawers and on counters. Tom glanced at it and assumed it was Benny's and put it back. He thought nothing more about it for 3 weeks. In late March, he came downstairs at midnight and Elena was coming in from the back porch mid-phone call, laughing in a register he hadn't heard from her in months. She saw him and switched to Visayan and finished the call in under a minute. She said, with the casual ease of someone who'd prepared for this, that it was her sister in Cebu. He had learned a few words over the years, but had no idea what she had said. He said okay. She went back to bed. He stood at the kitchen sink and thought about Tuesday afternoons. A drawing he'd assumed was Benny's. A phone call that changed languages when he walked into the room. He was a man whose job was to find the thing in the frame that didn't belong. The frame was his marriage. He stood in the kitchen with the faucet running and thought he knew what he was looking at. He followed her on the first Tuesday in September. He told himself various things during the first 10 minutes. That he happened to be going south. That he needed something from a hardware store nearby. He stayed 3 cars back on Pacific Highway. When she turned off the county road, he gave her 2 minutes before following. He parked at the far end of a lot he'd never been in before. The park didn't announce itself from the road. A gap in the tree line, a chain-link fence with a broken latch someone had repaired with zip ties, and someone else had cut through again. Picnic tables in the shade of a stand of Douglas fir, their paint gone gray and soft at the edges. Folding tables set end to end in the open, covered with dishes and trays, and the evidence of a gathering that happened here regularly enough that everyone already knew where to stand. September light came through the firs at a low, flat angle, and laid itself across the grass in long strips, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they're being studied. Tom sat with the engine off and watched his wife carry a covered dish across the grass toward people he'd never seen before. She moved the way she always moved, unhurried, precise, her attention already on the gathering before she reached it. She set her dish on the table, and a woman in a dark headscarf came forward and took Elena's arms when they embraced, holding them a moment after they broke apart the way people hold arms when they mean something by it. Elena laughed at something the woman said. Tom had been watching Elena from across rooms in their own house for months, noting the presence and absence of that specific laugh, and here it was in a park in Federal Way directed at a woman whose name he didn't know. He had his hand on the door handle. He was approaching the word relief, the particular relief of a man whose worst theory has been disproven. She wasn't pulling away from him, she was volunteering. That was all it was. Then a boy ran past the truck. 7 or 8 years old, dark-haired, running with the full-body abandon of a child who hasn't yet learned to ration his joy, arms pumping, sneakers scattering gravel at the edge of the lot, laughing at something behind him with his whole face completely open to it. Tom's hand came off the door handle. He knew that smile. He had seen it preserved in a photograph in the rubble of a back bedroom in Syria, in a frame with a cracked corner, in a moment that had already ended before he ever found it. He had stared at it in that demolished room and set it face up on a shelf, and told himself it was over, and walked away. The boy ran past and disappeared into the grass. Tom sat in the truck with his hands in his lap, the engine ticking quietly as it cooled, and understood that the distance between that bedroom in Syria and this parking lot in Federal Way was not, had never been, as large as he'd believed. He was out of the truck before he'd made the decision to move. His legs carried him across the gravel and through the gap in the fence and onto the grass. Elena looked up, and her expression moved through surprise, and something adjacent to guilt, and then something else. A readiness, a decision being made quickly. She crossed to him. A volunteer woman passed between them going the other direction, smiled at Tom with the open warmth of someone who didn't know what she was walking into, and said, "Is this your husband? Fatima will want to meet him sometime." She kept walking. Elena kept walking toward Tom. He couldn't take his eyes off the boy, who had stopped running and stood near a picnic table watching Tom with the frank curiosity children have before they learn it's rude to stare. Dark eyes, fully present, eating something from a small container without particular concern for anything. "Tom," Elena said quietly, "what are you doing here?" "Who is that child?" he said. "His name is Amir. His mother is Fatima. They came through the resettlement program in the spring." She paused. "I've been volunteering here since April. I didn't tell you because every time anything touched that region you just shut down." She stopped. She was reading his face now with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered. "What is it?" The boy looked at Tom, then looked away and laughed at something another child said beside him. "I need to tell you something," Tom said. "Can we sit in the truck?" They sat watching the park, the windows cracked, feeling the cool fall air. Park sounds came through the cracked window. Voices, a gust through the firs. Somewhere a child's laughter cutting through the quiet. Tom told her about the shot. Not the operational language, the plain version. The one he'd been rehearsing inside his own head for 9 months without ever giving it to anyone. The target, the confirmation, the authorization, the conditions. The morning on the hillside. The way the wind ran steady from the northwest. The way the world simplified itself down to distance and angle and breath. He told it without minimizing it and without dressing it up. Then he told her about the photograph. He described it exactly. The man, the boy on his shoulders, both of them laughing in that unguarded way. The cracked frame, the gray dust. The way he'd stood in that room longer than he should have, and set the photograph face up on the shelf, and walked out and said nothing to anyone. He described the image that had been waiting for him on the ceiling at 2 a.m. for 9 months. The same image every time, unchanging. He told her the boy in that photograph and the boy at the picnic table were the same boy. Elena was very still. She had the qualities she carried when processing something large, not rushing toward where it would land, moving through each layer of it carefully. Elena told Tom about the resettlement program for asylum seekers. They came through as refugees from a small village near Damascus. She looked at the boy, who was sitting at the picnic table now in the afternoon light, ordinary and present, eating without concern for anything in the world. "She has done nothing wrong," Elena said. "Not an argument, a fact being placed alongside other facts." "I trust you," Tom said. "But the intel I had did not have those names. That child has done nothing." "I know." The wind moved through the firs at the edge of the lot, a low sound that came and settled. "I have sat across from that woman every Tuesday for 5 months, Elena said. "I've taught her English with flashcards. I've helped her fill out school enrollment forms for Amir. I've eaten food she cooked for me." She stopped. "She is a person, not a situation, a person." "I know she is," Tom said. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" she said. He looked at the boy sitting in the September light. He thought about the difference between what is right and what is bearable, about whether those two things carry any obligation to be the same, about what it means to have done your job correctly at every single step, and to end up sitting in a parking lot watching a child who no longer has a father eat a snack in the afternoon sun. "What I have to do," he said. He took out his phone. Elena looked at his hands, then she reached over and put her hand on top of his, not to stop him, not to grant permission, just to be there for it. He made the call. They stayed, neither of them decided to. Tom didn't start the truck and Elena didn't ask him to. They sat with the park visible through the windshield, and they didn't say much, and they waited. The vehicles came 35 minutes later, 2 of them. Government plates, dark, pulling into the lot without urgency, the way authority arrives when it has already determined what it will do. 4 people got out and crossed the grass toward the gathering, with their hands visible and their faces professionally neutral. The change moved through the picnic the way a shift of wind moves through water, the volunteers going still first, then the families, and then the woman in the headscarf turning from the folding table where she'd been helping pack up dishes. She saw them. She didn't run. She stood and pulled Amir close with one arm and bent her head and spoke something brief into his hair. The kind of words you say to a child when the words can't do what you need them to do, but silence is worse. Amir looked up at his mother, then at the 4 people arriving, then at his mother again. He began to understand. He was crying by the time they reached the vehicles. Not loudly, the quiet crying of a child who has already learned that volume doesn't change outcomes. His mother kept her hand on the back of his head as they walked, not guiding, just there. The September light lay in long strips across the grass. Tom watched all of it. He had been trained to observe things other people walked past without seeing, and he observed this completely. The woman's straight spine, the boy's sneakers dragging slightly at the heel, the way the volunteers stood in their small clusters and didn't quite look at each other. The way the woman who had embraced Elena at the start of the afternoon now stood alone near the grill with her arms folded across her chest, looking at the gap in the fence where the vehicles had gone. He had taken a shot that was lawful and correct and necessary. He had made a phone call that was lawful and correct and necessary. Both things were true. Both would remain true. The cost was the cost. Elena's hand was still on his. The drive home was mostly quiet. The city moved past on either side. Strip malls, a storage facility with a sign in the window that said "Sorry, closed," until further notice in letters faded enough to suggest no one planned to update it. The ordinary texture of a world that hadn't been consulted about what kind of afternoon this was. Benny was at a neighbor's house. The 38th Street house was quiet when they came in. Evening light lay across the kitchen floor tiles in a shape Tom had seen 1,000 times without registering it. The kitchen smelled like coffee that had been sitting in the pot since morning. Elena went to the counter and stood with her back to him. Then she turned around. "I used to bring Amir drawings that Benny made," she said. "I thought he'd like having something from another boy his age." They were the same age. She stopped. "They have the same laugh. The exact same laugh." The kitchen held that. Tom looked at his hands. "I should have told you," he said. "About the photograph, from the beginning. I should have been open about what I was going through." Elena said she was sorry that she hadn't told Tom about volunteering. "It's not your fault. I was the one who kept you out, who couldn't share what I was feeling." Outside on 38th Street, a car moved slowly past. From the neighbor's house, faint but unmistakable, they could hear Benny's voice, audible at that distance when he was excited, which was most of the time. Elena came away from the counter and sat down at the table. Tom sat across from her. They stayed there for a long time, in the kitchen that smelled like old coffee. While the evening light moved across the tiles and the neighbor's house went quiet, and eventually Benny came home and was fed and put to bed. And Tom and Elena sat in the particular silence of two people who have been through the same thing from opposite directions and are not yet sure what it means to have been standing next to each other when it landed. But they were in the same room. That was different. That was the first different thing. They started seeing a counselor in October, a woman named Darlene Marsh who kept her office above, a tax preparation place on 6th Avenue, and who had a quality of complete stillness when she listened that Tom found after the second session genuinely impossible to perform in front of. They went on Wednesday evenings. The office smelled faintly of the coffee from the place below. Through the window was a view of the parking structure across the street, which offered nothing useful to anyone and sat there doing its job anyway. They worked at the thing that didn't have clean language. It wasn't guilt exactly. Guilt implies a wrong was done, and neither of them had done wrong. The counselor called it moral residue, the weight that remains after you've done the correct thing, and the correct thing still costs something real. Understanding it didn't remove it. Understanding it was just the beginning of deciding how to carry it. Tom thought about it the way he thought about everything the job had asked him to think about. He was part of a team. He had to trust his team to do their jobs, to do what was right. He hoped Fatima and Amir were doing good wherever they were. On a Wednesday evening in November, 6 weeks into the sessions, Tom said something he hadn't planned to say. "I thought about that photograph every day for 9 months. Every day the same image, the man, the boy, the laugh. But I thought about who the boy was in the picture." He stopped. "I never thought about who he was going to become. I didn't think past it." Elena was looking at her hands. "And then he's there," Tom said, "running in a parking lot laughing, and he's not the boy in the picture anymore. He's a different version of him. An older version. One that exists because of what I did and because of how it all landed." The room was quiet. From below, very faintly, a phone rang twice in the tax office and stopped. "I wonder if he kept them," Elena said quietly. "The drawings. I used to bring him Benny's drawings and he'd fold them and put them in his jacket pocket, very carefully." She paused. "I wonder if he kept them." She reached over and took Tom's hand. Not to signal resolution. Not to indicate that anything was fine now. Just the way you reach for someone when the space between you has been cold and wide, and you want to close some of it, even briefly, even knowing it won't close all the way. Tom looked at their hands. There was nothing to say that was adequate to what was true. That was also something he was learning, that not every true thing needed language, that some things could be carried together without being solved, that carried together was not the same as solved, but was, on certain evenings in a small office above a tax preparation place on 6th Avenue in Tacoma. Enough. In December, Tom fixed the fence post on the east side of the yard. The morning was cold and clear, the sound visible between the houses on the far street, a flat gray line barely moving at the edge of the world. Benny was outside with him, handing tools with the focused seriousness he brought to any task he'd assigned himself a role in. He handed Tom a flathead when Tom needed a Phillips. Tom traded it without comment. "Close enough," he said. Benny beamed as if he'd solved an engineering problem. Tom drove the post and checked it and drove it again. The cold air came off the sound and moved through the gap between the houses. He could smell the neighbors' wood smoke and the wet grass and the particular smell of winter work. Cold metal, cold soil. The exertion of something simple being done correctly. He thought about a woman keeping her hand on the back of a boy's head while she walked toward a government vehicle in September. He thought about where that boy was now. Somewhere in the sequence of what comes after a parking lot in Federal Way. Whether there was enough to eat. He thought about a framed photograph set face up on a shelf in a ruined room in Syria, the dust still settling around it. The man and the boy mid-laugh in a moment that had already ended. Benny handed him the level without being asked. Tom looked at the boy, this specific boy, standing in the gray December light, and felt something that wasn't resolution, but lived in the same general territory. The specific weight of being exactly here, this yard, this cold morning. This child's face tilted up at him. He felt the weight of his decisions, then felt the grain of the fence post under his hands, and the sound of his son narrating something under his breath a few feet away. He took the level. The fence post was straight. He stood with the level in his hand and looked at the flat gray line of the sound between the houses, barely moving at the edge of everything. Then he set the level down on the top rail. He picked up the hammer and finished what he was doing. Thanks for listening. These stories take time to get right, and knowing you're here makes it worth it. If you want more, hit that subscribe button. And if someone in your life would connect with this, share it with them. See you next time.